Great. So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We have a global audience with us today. So welcome to Community Online Academy. My name's Laura. I'm so excited to have you all with us today. This is Resiliency Training Intro, myself and Greg. So excited to have you here. We've been running COAs for 7 weeks now, and we've had over 80 classes today. So we've got a lot going on. So excited that you joined our session. Before we jump into things, wanted to cover a little bit of a Zoom etiquette, if you will, that will help us have a really great quality session today. So I'll start with, we mentioned this when you were on the call. It's like, tell us your name and where you're from to rename. So how you can do that, you can go to your participant list, hover over your name, that little more button there, and you can rename. We're encouraging everyone to do their first name, comma, where you're calling in from. It's really cool to see where everyone is globally and across the US today. Additionally, would love to see you. If you are technically able to turn on your camera, we would love to see you. It adds so much to the session. Additionally, if you want to play with how you're seeing everything on the screen, you can toggle between the speaker view and the gallery view on that right up-hand corner. Additionally, ask that you please stay on mute unless you are speaking. This will have a great impact to the audio quality and make everyone a quality session today. And lastly, feel free to take advantage of the chat. I know we've been using that a little bit already. If you have a question or comment, we'll have some times for Q&A, but it is there if you need it. So without further ado, I'll just stop sharing my screen and I'll hand it over to Greg to kick us off, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Laura. Welcome, everyone. I'm Greg Kunkel. I'm one of the co-founders here at NextJump, and I think this topic, resiliency, I think it's personal, and I think it's so many people are talking about it. It's in the news. There's a lot of articles. And I think a big part of it is, I have, not only a business I'm running, I have a 9 and 11-year-old boy, juggling 2 working parents, kids that aren't in school, summer programs have now been canceled. A lot of change that's happening. I think all of us, myself included, want a little bit more resiliency, if not a lot more resiliency. And I think it's been interesting for us as an organization. We've been working really hard and have gotten really well known. We got named by Harvard as one of 3 deliberately developmental organizations. And put the jargon aside, what that really means is building organizations that at the heart builds adaptive learning teams, the ability to change, the ability to kind of grow, develop, and meet kind of stressors for it. And we've been fortunate to work with thousands of organizations, from the CIA to Air Force to Navy to tech companies to education to nonprofits. And really about what this is to kind of give you a under the hood look at our own resiliency training. It's a peer coaching program, sharing with you in many ways what we share with our staff. We also do and run for other organizations of the first kind of class for that, almost the context behind it, and to give you a little bit of bird's eye view. So Laura and I will tag team. She just finished her resiliency training, and you share a little bit of her journey and more of the nuts and bolts. But I'm going to share my screen. And I think the objective for today is hopefully you take some parts away from you, both around resiliency, but also, if interested, some tactical tips either for you individually, or if you want to, and one of the things we're doing is sharing with teams as part of this to help you get started with your own team internally at whatever organization you're part of. So let me just full screen this. And so I'm going to kick it off. There was a great article recently in The Atlantic, and it talked about the British in World War II and what they went through, and it compared it to kind of American society right now under COVID. And if you want to go to take a look at it, but the fascinating part with the British, especially around when they got the article was about when they started to get bombed, and it was 3 to 4 months of really heavy bombing, and hundreds and thousands of people were dying, sometimes in a given evening. And the predictions when it started was that people would in many ways kind of lose their minds. And it was fascinating when they did the research afterwards that in fact the society at large grew more resilient in the way they measured it. And in fact, neighborhoods that got bombed the worst, they had the most deaths, the most tragedy, the hardest times, are actually the most resilient. And so there's been a lot of research on why, and one element of it is, which I liked, is that one core part of what they did was they confronted the truth together. They didn't have blind optimism that it was going to be better or that people weren't going to die. And then they discovered and talked about resources to cope with it together. And probably one of the most predominant, the predominant kind of researchers in terms of resiliency is a Harvard professor, Mahdi. And one of the things he talks about in their research and they've done is what he calls kind of 3 keys to it. And so next to it, I put my own kind of terminology, how we think about it internally. But the first one is control. Can you take control? If you're on the team, can you have people take control? We call it oars in the water. When there's stressful, when there's change, can you put oars in the water and action on things that you can control? The second piece is, do you look at stress and a challenge? Do you look at it as a challenge? What's called in research a growth mindset from Carol Dweck from Stanford. Or is it almost an, oh my God? It's my own terminology. The third part is commitment. And I put commitment, it could be to commitment to yourself, commitment in terms of your team, commitment in terms of the project. And if those 3 things are worked on, resiliency can be fostered and built upon. And the main takeaway that I think is eye-opening, shows up in the research, is this is not a born trait. Some people are probably born more or less resilient, but it can be trained for. So I'm not going to, this is the only slide I have on organizational resilience, less from an individual standpoint, but sharing with you, I did a presentation at one today on adaptive learning teams, and there are 4 key traits of organizationally resilient teams. The first one is transparency of information. Can you share data, teams, situational awareness? Can you talk about problems in particular? The second one is this always be training. Always be training, whether it's skill on yourself, this belief at the core, the team and individual can get better. And in fact, I think this is related to that individual resiliency research around you can get better and actually stress actually gives an opportunity. So I actually am heartened by so much interest in resiliency right now, you know, given this, and that I think despite the challenging circumstances, we're all in varying degrees. I think people are looking at ways that they can improve their response to it. The third part is distributed decision-making. So not only decision-making at the top, but distributing that. And the last part is connectingness, this notion of doing it together. So that's from a team standpoint. So dialing back down, one of the parts that we use as a litmus test for resilient or not is I think about when you have an idea or you want to build something great. And one of the things I think is a false mental model for a lot of us, myself included, is that I think we hope when we go after something that we're proud of, that we want to grow into, or it's a concept, an idea, something that we're innovating for, is that you chip away at it, you work really hard at it, you'll eventually get there. But the reality looks a little bit closer to something like this in this journey. I know it's a busy slide, so I'll kind of walk you through it. But oftentimes with the new idea, the beginning part's kind of fun. It's fun to work on new things. Then slowly it becomes harder than you think. All of a sudden you realize it's going to be a lot more work. It gets to a point often, if it's something really great, something that hasn't been created before, you start to be like, this sucks, I have no idea what I'm doing. That part is a crossroads of where many of us give up or work through it. And that notion of working through it often takes belief, persistence. We'll talk about it, what it also takes a little bit more of being very open to kind of feedback and others. But getting to a part where you can build back up. That, what we call a swamp of going through that emotional journey is what is, you know, the other side of hard is what takes to be great. It requires conflict resolution. It requires awareness, self-awareness, team awareness. But most of us actually get into conflict avoidance in the sense of as soon as it becomes really difficult, we give up, we opt out. We stop wanting to get feedback. We hide on some of this stuff. We feel embarrassed about it. Very normal human behaviors. Building the skills of conflict resolution is actually at the crux of resilience. Brené Brown many of you may be familiar with her. If not, she does great work in research around vulnerability, courage is very closely related to. And just, you know, yesterday had up this I like this from on Twitter of hitting the wall is real. Hard days suck. There's nothing wrong with us. We're going to be okay. And going back to this, it gets at both. is that building something great is going to require hitting challenges, hitting bumps. We can be training on how to go and run towards those challenges to handle our emotional element, working through that, and it's normal to get to the other side. And that's really at the heart of this resiliency training and this peer coaching. So one other part of research I'll share with you is from Bob Keegan, one of the preeminent psychologists and professors at Harvard on adult development. And I think his research has shown, I think, that turns its head on burnout. And he says, consider for one moment that the research shows the single biggest cause of burnout, which many of us, I think, equate to lack of resiliency at work, is not work overload. It's not being overly stressed per se, but being too long in a work setting without experiencing your own further unfolding, which gets back to that very similar part of one of the core 3 things that Maddie touched on. So when I think about a plant, I think it's very normal for a plant. If a plant looked more like this bottom part, after 5 years, the plant was still the same as where it was before, you would say something's wrong with the plant. Yet, oftentimes as individuals, we'll stun our own growth. And when you audit yourself in your own personal development, is that 90 days ago, a year ago, 5 years ago, we actually run and are operating in a similar path. So I share that with you in terms of, an interesting, I think, point that research has shown up. So dialing back a little bit into now some more tactical parts, when we think about getting better and going to something, whether it's a project that you're on, your team you're on, you may have goals, yourself, your own goals. Maybe you want to be a better writer, a better doctor, a better husband, a better father. We often will talk about what is our path that we want to do? What's our strategy to get there? This kind of getting better. And that's something that is often talked about at work, within family. What we don't talk about is what happens if it gets worse. We don't like to talk about it. We don't like to talk about problems. We don't like to talk about the fear that what happens if it gets worse. And you can see in organizations, even with the COVID response, if I sat in a boardroom, I sat within a team meeting, the teams that could openly talk about how this might get worse and game plan for it, go through those darker scenarios, I would have been able to predict right there if that team was going to be better equipped to adapt, change, and grow towards where they needed to go. But most of us don't like to talk about it. So what happens when our strategy of being a better father, a better leader, a better husband, a better teammate starts to run into problems? Our perfect plan doesn't go according to plan. Now all of a sudden we don't talk about it. So what happens over time? People stop taking risks and putting out where they want to go to for fear it may never happen. That's what Bob Keegan talks about over time leads to burnout. So we have 2 parts internally that we train for. One is more peer coaching, which is this 13-week resiliency training, which we're going to get more into the nuts and bolts. The other one is what we call more toughness training, not only taking the punch, which is more resiliency, taking the punch and moving on, but actually going and winning. And then I'll pause for a second. I'll ask a question on the chat. When we think about resiliency training, at the very heart of it, and Laura will go into more details on her part, is this notion of it's not feedback receiving, but it's what we call our red arrow behaviors, this echo chamber of silence. And so you think about here, and I use this example of oftentimes, and they've shown that we're the sum of the 5, 6 closest people around us. And when we have echo chambers, people are afraid to give us feedback, afraid to talk authentically about the real things going on. You can train them and ask them to give you better feedback. A lot of people have said, Greg, how do I get people around me to give me better feedback? That is one path, and there are things to do on that side. But here's another part, which goes back into more things that we can control, what I can control. What are my behaviors? We call them red arrow behaviors that make it difficult for others around me to tell me the truth. One of the things I talk about and I use that I turned it on its head for me is when you're at a dinner table, you're with your family and all of a sudden there's silence. People aren't speaking up anymore. This notion that silence is the greatest form of hostility. We don't think about it that way. We think of hostility more as conflict, anger, arguing with each other. I'd advocate that for healthy conflict, yes, there is unhealthy conflict, but silence as this form of hostility is something that has given me a mental model to actually work through some of those difficult conversations. So I'm going to ask you to pause for a second. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to share with you mine and then ask you to put into the kind of chat your own, just what comes to mind, your own red arrow behavior. So I'll give you a very little behavior that drives my mom nuts, my wife nuts, that I've worked really hard to get over. But when my mom would call me and say, Greg, how are you doing? I'm an optimist. I don't like to talk about problems. Our family motto was Kunkel, suck it up. My mom would call and say, Greg, how are you doing? I'm good, I'm fine. That would be my de facto answer for everything. How difficult is it if someone that knows me, my wife or somebody else, my wife will tell me the truth even regardless, but when I say I'm fine, it puts a lot of social pressure on someone to say, actually, Greg, I notice that you're not fine. What are all these problems that you have that you're not sharing? Or I say that and they're not fine. Now all of a sudden I'm putting a lot of burden on them to now they have to be the one that talks about and becomes more authentic in sharing what's challenging for them. So there was no malicious intent behind it. It was just a habit that I had. But that was an example of one of my red arrow behaviors that prevented others from telling me the truth about myself or sharing with them. So I have this said, if you don't mind, just take a second. There are no wrong answers to this. What comes to mind of your own red arrow behaviors? Interrupting, avoiding, yeah, staying high level, defensive, totally. I'll do that myself. Excuses. You know, Brene Brown, different people have different words for kind of red arrow behaviors. That's the language we use. Brene Brown calls it your armor. It's normal. We all have self-defense mechanisms in place that we shield of letting people really know us. And there are times for that. That's a normal defense mechanism. I don't necessarily go to my board of directors and start sharing up with all my problems right away. There's circles of safety. But when I have those same habits with my wife, with my kids, with my colleagues, with people I lead, that has some very destructive elements around. And how do I adapt to change if people around me aren't speaking up and telling me the truth? So keep going on this. This is great. You can see it. I just have a few more slides and I'll turn over to Laura. So 2 other slides. And so I shared this in my previous presentation as well, but I like it. And this comes from Bob Keegan as well in his research. And it's another word for red arrow behavior, what he calls a second job. In an ordinary organization, most people are doing a second job no one's paying them for. And this is across, research shows it's across all types of organizations: military, education, nonprofits, hospitals, for-profit companies. We're spending our time and energy covering up their weaknesses, managing other people's impressions of them, showing themselves to their best advantage, hiding. We regard this as the single biggest loss of resources that organizations suffer every day. So yes, organizations have a role to it, but I would argue, and one of the things that shows up in research is that being able to be authentic, things that I can control, getting feedback, talking about my challenges, talking about the things that I need to do to improve, it is contagious. The absence of it is contagious. I lie, I fake, is what we call it. I show my mask, I do my second job, others around me will also. Certainly as a leader, it's infectious, but the reverse is also true. I start to be more authentic. I start to be around people. I talk about things. I don't hide. I take off that mask. It's also infectious. And that is at the heart of this peer coaching, this resiliency training that we do. I'll leave you with this and I'll turn over to get Laura to get more into the nuts and bolts. But I'll share with you of some counterparts to this of what do high performing teams look like. And this is an experiment that's been run thousands of times. You can look at it of kind of the Marshmallow Project, the Spaghetti Project. There's been TED Talks on it around what do high performing teams look like. And they did this experiment initially, and it's done thousands of times. They've done variations of it with 4 groups of 5 to 6 people, a group of kindergartners, a group of MBA students, of business students, a group of lawyers, and a group of CEOs, so executives that run their own organization. And the task was this: they had 3 ingredients. They had a marshmallow, spaghetti, dried spaghetti, and tape, and they had 18 minutes to create the highest tower. None of them were trained in how to create a tower out of these three ingredients. And so, which group could build consistently the highest tower? So the punchline to this is that it was the kindergartners. And in fact, the MBA students were the worst. So kindergartens averaged 28 inches, their tower height. COs were closest. MBA students were the worst. So if we had a little bit less, you can put it in chat if you want. So why? What is the fundamental difference between kindergartens and MBA students? It's the first time I heard this, I had to kind of go look it up. I didn't quite believe it. But there are a few different things on this, and it actually is connected. It's connected back to the research that Maddie found on resilience. One of the things that MBA students did was the first 5 to 7 minutes, they argued and talked about as a group, probably politely to an extent, who was going to be the final decision maker and what their strategy for it was. The kindergartners just get started. They get started, each of them kind of on their own. They sit side by side, they build. In fact, there's a lot less talking in the beginning. They build it, one falls apart, one doesn't. They see what kind of works. On average, MBA students build one prototype, typically done within 30 seconds before the end of the 18 minutes. Kindergartners have 7 prototypes on average by the time they finish. They are constantly learning and growing, and they are constantly failing and being okay with failing. That second mask they don't do. And so the one part I'll just share is there are 2 groups that beat them. Architects, they've been trained on how to do this. So if you're very well trained, you can still probably put on your masks. But most of us are now in roles and circumstances, and that's where change, where we're facing things that we don't know. The last one, which I find is interesting, is if you had one executive assistant into that group of CEOs, it goes up by more than 25% in terms of their tower height. And it's fascinating when they watch that executive assistant, they're not giving ideas on how to build a higher tower. They're being mindful of making the group more successful in what they're doing, keeping on time, keeping on task. It's fascinating what the role of a team dynamics can look like. So I tie this back to the individual resiliency, which I led with. Think about what the kindergartners did. They put their oars in the water. They had a growth mindset. They weren't afraid of failing. They tried, they failed, they looked at each other, and they borrowed what worked from each other. And they had a commitment to each other. They didn't hide, they didn't status manage. Those are the parts that are keys to resiliency. And in fact, I would argue what kids are somewhat better at in the beginning. So with that, Laura, I'm going to turn over to you. I'll drive from here if you'd like.
Great. Awesome. Great. Thank you. So hello, everybody. I have been a neck shrimper for over 10 years. And as Greg mentioned, I wanted to give you an idea, how a little bit more in practice, how resiliency training works and my experience through it as a participant. And also a little bit as a teacher. I'm now starting to train our captains of our resiliency training and have completed the 13-week program myself. So this is a screenshot of one of our Zooms during training. We've been adapting from work from home. We're a group of 12, and we found that sweet spot is between the groups of 8 people to 12 people. So you can preserve anonymity when you do use app feedback, but also get that diversity of thought in person. And it's harder to over-index on just one voice with that many people as well. Before jumping into specifics, I wanted to share on a high level the biggest lessons this experience has personally given to me so far. So if you hit next, Greg. The first one is really how much other people really pick up on. These behaviors, we're calling them the red arrow behaviors, are signals that you're sending out to others. And to you, they seem very small or like they even wouldn't matter. But I learned that your perception of things is oftentimes much different than the receiver, and that part matters. Because things are so close to you, you really don't understand the way that it's coming off to other people. You think you do, but it surprised me just how differently others felt. And the second was really the second and third order consequences that these behaviors cause. For me, the training has been a really eye-opening experience to see the unintended ripple effect of some of my behaviors. Some of them quite small, but messages and signals and consequences that I did not want to be sending. So if you go on to the next slide, a quick overview, what does resiliency training consist of in practice? So it is a 13-week program, so not a one-off workshop. You're not a one and done with this type of thing. It does take that commitment, as Greg was talking about. We have one consistent group of peers meeting 1 hour a week for over 13 weeks. And this is designed specifically to create community within the group, but also accountability again between its members. There are 3 phases. You have the initial investment, the first signs of success, and what we're calling the ROI period in phase 3. So each phase has its own flavor of format, but all of them are focused around the things that we can control as individuals, identifying and dialing down what we call those red arrow behaviors of the things that we do for others, make it harder for us to tell the truth. And most importantly, this is done together as a team. Everyone is participating. There is no coach or leader of this. Everyone is on equal footing and helping each other. So if you go to the next slide, this is a visualization of my overall experience to the training as a participant. I'm going to walk through the 3 phases and share the impact they had on me, but also some of what the hardest parts were, and some tips, what I've seen from my group, and then also other groups throughout the company. As you can see, I've had my ups and downs, but eventually I had a bit of an aha moment, which helped me bring things into perspective. So if you go into the next slide, I'll start with phase 1. Starting with the first session was actually, probably the lowest point of the entire training. It's kind of where you're coming to terms with the exercise, and likely most of us are grappling with the fact that we've been stuck or hiding or, complacent, if you will. And that's not an amazing feeling. I grabbed excerpts from kind of like our session notes, and, 50% of the group, it was easier to accept, but, the other 50% of the group had a lot of resistance and actually like fight and struggled with any stigma that would be attached to the training. We start each of the sessions with a what's on your mind, and it's kind of an open discussion. So we had a lot of people saying, why am I here? Am I really stuck? And it's also hard to be open right off the bat. Your group really doesn't have established trust. You know these people, they're your peers, but you're still trying to figure out the dynamic. The main content of the first session is actually pretty heavy as well. You spend time actually putting pen to paper, fears, and realistically, what would happen to you and those around you, peers, family, friends, if you got worse, at your core role and sharing that. So for example, for me, I'm in charge of our New York flagship project, which is building out our new future office space. So my errors and poor judgment calls could literally cost the company millions of dollars. And I'm additionally accountable to a whole office of over 60 people where, normal circumstances, you would come every day, and so much more riding on that project. I would have a ton of shame, if I let next jumpers down. I think the hardest part here, if you click, is that as a participant and, like a captain of a group, is to actually not try to solve for any of these things. Some people share some pretty personal fears. Our session in particular did get really emotional, and especially if people are vulnerable, it's so natural to be like, oh, it's not going to be not that bad, or how to make it better, or how to solve for it, but part of this training is actually to really be able to talk about that negative, the downside, and realize, yes, we have control over our destiny, but there are realities if we don't prioritize our growth. And, just sitting in that negativity is harder than you think and really difficult. But when you get to the second session, this is when you start getting to the specifics of your red arrow behaviors. You start to feel, I did at least feel a little bit better coming out of that session, realizing that everyone has the things that they need to work on, and there are a decent amount of commonalities, people struggling with similar things that you are. I saw so many things in the chat earlier that I related to, and that makes you feel less alone. So as you start identifying those red arrow behaviors, you start to get some truth from the group, things that you didn't know that you were doing. The first time that I presented, I got some hard feedback. It was very hard to hear, not only in person, but also in the app. Hold on, we gotta put someone on mute here because we're getting a little interference. Thank you. Awesome. I'll spotlight this a little bit later, but my peers brought up to me that my outward expression of emotion prevented them from really being able to give me full, unfiltered feedback. And I was actually pretty angry at some of the feedback I got initially, and defensive, essentially, like, WTF, these people don't get me. So acceptance is a journey. But here's a sheet of some of the most common behaviors that we've seen coming out of different trainings. I'm doing my best. I got it. Defensiveness, shutting down. I saw humor and sarcasm, in the chat. And these are all, I totally get it. Right, for me, I'm right in this box here. I got it. Fine, good. It's very buttoned up. So another challenge that I'll point out at this phrase, if you hit next, Greg, is that it's really easy, not quite, there you go, great, thanks. It's really easy to be generic. Like, I shut other people down. Okay, maybe, but how do you talk over people? Do you just never stop talking? The more specific that you can get, it will help you as the group, as you move into that phase 2 and phase 3, prioritizing the behaviors and then practicing to dial them all down. So if you do hit next now, I won't go through everything, but this is my actual red arrow behavior worksheet. So there's obviously a lot here. You don't need to read it all. But I thought it would be helpful to expose, how I, based on the feedback, I was able to evolve my list between the sessions. I color coded them, some of the nuances and edits that the group helped me make through the training. So for me, I tend not to vent or expose my own issues very openly. And this has created an unintentional barrier for others to bring up problems to me, whether it be theirs or my own problems, as the appearance that I give off is that I have everything together, even though I don't. But as a result, people don't want to expose their messiness and their problems to me. And, talk about getting specific. One of my big ones was this arrow of being buttoned up, and diving into that with the group. They helped me pick up on the nuance. This was something that I was doing in email as well as in person, which I was totally not aware of. And now I see all the time, starting to catch myself a little bit more. I think a lot of us relate to using crutch words or phrases. So mine was like the good, great, fine, I got it when asked how something was going. But essentially that's acting as a blocker and sending the message of just leave me alone. So if you go to the next slide, if you move to phase 2, you start to prioritize the behaviors so you know which ones are the most important. So I wanted to share how I went about doing that. So I went back through all of my session notes from the in-person sessions, and I combined that with what people wrote in the app. So basically what it is you come and you present, that worksheet that I just showed in the earlier thing, and you kind of open the floor for the group to give you feedback. And at the end, there's an opportunity to leave anonymous feedback in the app as well. So you've kind of got a little bit of both. You've got that in-person experience going on and then followed up with the anonymous feedback. So, my main signal was pretty clear. Most of my in-person feedback from the discussion was, around that buttoned up arrow of I've got it, which I mentioned. But in the app, something else showed up as well, which was this emotional piece. So, looking at the feedback app, which is the same app that you all have access to today to leave anonymous feedback on the sessions, I was looking at it as a source of quantitative data. So I think of all the pieces of feedback that I had so far, I think there were 36 pieces of them, supplemental. Emotions in some capacity was mentioned in 20% of them. So to me, that was an indicator that's not really something to brush off. It's not just one person's opinion. It's coming up several times. So I took out a couple excerpts here. These are a couple of the actual pieces of feedback that I received. So, the app created an outlet where people were able to call out that piece, which they felt like they couldn't talk to me about in person. So between, the in-person and the app, I was able to get a more accurate and full picture of my red arrow behaviors, which I thought was very helpful. I was minimizing the impact of the emotional piece. I talked a little bit about my reaction before. I was like, geez, it's not like I'm walking around crying all the time. And frankly, I just missed it. But after, seeing this and then bringing it up in my next session, people really opened up and shared to me that it was a barrier for them. So, a tip that I would give, for those in this phase would be to, challenge your assumptions and the reasons in your head for something, and instead prioritize how others are feeling over yourself. We all have the story going on in our head, but if you try to step out of it personally and put yourselves in their shoes with an open mind, just keep in mind that the group is ultimately trying to help you. So coming out of that, if you hit next, this is my now prioritized list, which behaviors are least important. We always start with those because it's a little bit easier to talk about those than the A's, which are the most important, to actually then work down to dial down or reduce. We talked about kind of my visceral A, but something that I had originally started and ranked as my C which was being emotional and oftentimes like crying during difficult conversations, moved up to an A per my group's feedback. And it also grew to include my facial expressions. I tend to wear my heart on my sleeve. So, I think that after, it was cool because after I brought it up, we were to have a productive conversation about it. This has been such an enlightening experience to me. If you go to the next slide, I mean, it certainly hasn't been an easy or flattering conversation. And talking about this stuff, over the 13 weeks, got a lot easier. There was like a lot less stigma to talking about it since we all had something we needed to work on. I've been able to see more impact in my awareness and perspective coming out of phase 3 in my day-to-day interactions, and have been helping other resiliency captains as we're running across the company. And I think the thing that I've been the most impressed with is the level of care, which I felt from my colleagues, which makes it so much easier to openly reflect and accept what people are saying. It's a cool dynamic. We've actually had like heated debates over other people's behaviors, but it's all coming from that place of care, which is really unique. And so in phase 3, you focus on dialing down these behaviors day to day. You come back and present to the group, checking back where you are, what's worked, what hasn't, what surprised you, how you felt like you might want to adjust it. It's all a work in progress, and it's certainly not done over the end of 13 weeks, but it does give you a great piece of that awareness. I mean, I took a few examples here of reflections, or as we call them, on my minds, from colleagues across the company who allowed it to share with you guys today. A couple pieces: no one has ever invested in me that much, grateful, people with so much care, all facing the same things, given me a new energy and perspective. And that's really echoed my experience as well. So, I've been so much easier to bring kind of like things up with the group as well. I feel a lot more close to them, much easier to start those difficult conversations. So that is a flavor of kind of my experience and a little bit more about some of the phases of training. So we'll open it up to questions. If you guys have any things that's on your mind, for me or for Greg, you can write them in the chat and we can, take them, call on you. We can talk out loud to them.
Yes, yeah. To echo what Laura said, any questions, just let us know. We'll try to answer as many as possible. I know some common questions, and post this on the kind of the course page itself. We'll post the Red Arrow Behavior worksheet. So you can do that with. I would encourage you, if you do that just with at least one other person. But again, we found the most effective is to set up your own peer coaching program, anywhere from 8 to 12. And we've just, as part of kind of COA in this, is any team that kind of wants to sign up for this, if you let us know, not only could you join in this kind of session, but we'll help you get set up and kind of the cabin set up on how to do it, how to facilitate it yourself, some of the lessons learned, the tools for it, so that the kind of the technology can be used as well. And that's all pro bono. We just teach you in many ways how to do this with your own team. So with this, why don't we take some questions, Laura?
Yeah, it looks like John from Dallas or Fort Worth, Texas has a good question if you want to unmute and ask. You're here, John.
Well, I think John's question was, oh, go ahead, John. I can read it. It says, so I think this is more for Laura, for you, but like, I think he was reacting to like your kind of two sides of feedback, of buttoned up, but then kind of emotional, or almost like two opposite sides. So how did you, how does that make sense? And how did you kind of react to that?
Yeah, actually, I mean, I thought that was a great insight, and it's something I didn't talk about, but something I noticed as well, is that they're kind of like polar opposites from one another. And I've actually, several people in our group had something similar to that as well. We have a colleague of mine that who tends to like coddle people, but then they're also seen as kind of like hostile. So it's kind of interesting how sometimes it can go both way on either side. So, I mean, for me, it's been a good reminder that, to achieve things is actually more about balance, and to not like overreact one way or another way in a situation. But I think it's actually absolutely fascinating. I think sometimes we talk about sometimes your weakness is like a form of your strength that's like too much or too little. So to me, it was a really interesting and common thing that we've been seeing from people.
There are some great questions here, by the way, so keep them coming. There was So Austin in the UK said, I think in the UK or London, Britain, people would be more reluctant to open up in this way, a cultural red arrow. It's fascinating. And so without question, there are cultural differences. And one of, I don't know if you've ever read the book by Malcolm Gladwell. He read kind of Tipping Point, several other books. But one of the examples he uses actually was Korean Airlines. And so our co-CEO is actually Korean. He talks about this. But they were, in the late 1900s, the single worst track record of airlines in terms of crashes. And when they dialed it back, one of the things that they found was that there was a cultural challenge. You have co-pilots in a plane. There's typically a senior pilot and a more junior co-pilot. And culturally, it's not looked upon well for a senior person to kind of admit weaknesses in front of a more junior person. And likewise, it's really not culturally, it's culturally frowned upon for a junior person to kind of speak up with ill will to a senior person. So one of the things as kind of a co-pilot, if the senior person was making a mistake, even if the junior person knew that it was a colossal mistake, culturally, it was not good to speak up. And so as they found this, one of the things that they did, and again, someone mentioned this as well, we use a term, it's dialing down. Dialing down, it's a chipping away at how do you dial down your behavior. And so one of the things they found was they actually went to English. So they actually used English because what they found is when they spoke English, some of those cultural things that kind of got in the way to be able to kind of speak truth in that part was just easier. It's easier for the senior person, it's easier for the junior person to speak up in that situation. And again, that's a dial down behavior. They still had some cultural challenges there. So anyways, I share that a bit. New Life from Wellington said, Laura, how did you manage moving from heart in your sleeve to managing both honesty, vulnerability, and holding your emotions together? Practical tips welcome. So that's a good one.
That is a good one. I don't know if I have the immediate answer to that, but I mean, I feel like it kind of came from a place of awareness. I think I just wasn't aware of a lot of the situations where some of this was popping up. So I think as soon as that became clear to me, I started being able to kind of react to it in clear time. Like the amount of times that I would just say, oh, it was good, and then just like end the conversation was like embarrassingly a lot. So that was, you know, a challenge. But I think one of the things that has helped me a lot is is actually teaching. So, you know, as much as I kind of went through these phases, I had a couple opportunities to kind of, you know, present and share on what was going on in the company. And that was actually a really useful experience to me and kind of helped kind of further solidify some of the learnings as I was able to kind of present them. And even presenting in these community online academies here has, you know, allowed me to come to more acceptance and kind of see between that, and hearing from other people like how much it's, you know, helped to hear my experience has actually made me feel, you know, lean into that a little bit more. So definitely don't have it all figured out. I definitely have slip ups all the time, but, you know, I think it kind of starts from that place of awareness.
Jennifer Willis had a great question of, I could use some advice on how to speak truthfully to someone, supervisors, coworkers, but still sound constructive. I always worry that I sound like I'm complaining. So great question. And so maybe I'll answer this in a couple ways. One is, and I bucket that question, so Jennifer, you can clarify if not, of especially giving feedback. So giving kind of, you know, constructive feedback, whether it's to a boss, it has a dynamic to it, but also peers has a social dynamic to it as well. So the first thing I'll say is that it's just a general part of make sure that you're working yourself first. You're around someone that's working on themselves. So for instance, that kind of truth teller, the one that's like always pointing out everybody else's problem, at times people do tune them out. So that's the first part. With that said, Kim Scott, and you can Google her and look at her. She came from Google, but she has a book called Radical Candor, and she's done a lot of research around this. Really awesome. And she talks about kind of, you know, candid feedback and giving feedback on two fronts. The degree of directness, so you're either giving it high or low directness, and then the degree of empathy. So is it high empathy or low empathy? So what you want, what she calls radical candor, is obviously is direct plus empathy. With that said, it takes practice to give really good feedback. And so one of the things she found was that the worst is actually obviously indirect and empathetic, and unempathetic. But what we found is that when you, if to start, try to practice be more direct first. Over time, you'll build empathy. It sounds it, but typically people that are just truth tellers, unless they're the boss and everybody's afraid to speak up to them, which that's a whole separate part. Most of the time you'll get feedback, social feedback, if you're giving always direct, candid feedback and you have no empathy. So over time, you'll improve. The challenge if you focus on empathy is that over time, it leads to just coddling, and it will lead actually to more and more indirectness, which is, I think, the worst place to be. So I'd encourage, and ultimately over indirectness, people lose faith that you're actually being, authentically empathetic. So if I had one part to practice, and there are tools and little tricks. So for instance, we train our team and I use it to just give little vocal cues. So for instance, this is difficult for me to say because I don't want to offend you, but this is hard for me and I may not be getting it, nor may I be right, but. So there are kind of techniques you can use and little tools to send signals to someone of your intention, that, that kind of axiom that we want to be judged by our actions, our intentions, yet we judge others based on their actions. So it can be a frustrating part of giving and receiving feedback. But if you send some signals along the way of what your judgment is, of what your intention is, that can also help. This is so good. Sam, you mentioned one type of red arrow behavior was staying high level. Can you talk more about what that means? I'll give you a very specific example. So one of the exercises we do, and I did this with it was a tech company, and we talk about what could get worse. And so this individual was a sales leader, and they're going through a tough time. It's a transformational part of their business. And they have their sales goals, but it's a challenging time, and the likelihood is that they're not going to hit their goals. So he brought up, as it may get worse and sales may go down. So that's a pretty generic statement to some extent. It's true, but as others giving feedback, people may nod and say, yeah, I could see it going down. So I shared this with him and he changed it. I said, well, what percentage will it go down? So he said, I could see it going down 80% in 3 months. And people were like, 80% in 3 months? And now all of a sudden it had a much richer conversation that some people were like, no way is it going to go down 80% in 3 months. And so my point being on this is that if you could share, for instance, about yourself or with others, is that it will cause more of a reaction to have a more authentic, kind of truthful conversation about what's in other people's heads as well.